acknowledge Dr. Teutsch and Krista for helping with the slides. Pastures, and you probably know this already, are rarely monocultures. We often plant certain things and expect them to be there, but it's hard to keep an exact monoculture, and we really don't want. It's nice to have several different species. And often our pastures are quite complex mixtures. And so the beginning of this presentation, I want to focus more on rejuvenating what you already have. And in the last part of the presentation, I'll spend more time on overseeding and trying to enhance the stands that you have. So I'm going to talk a bit about soil fertility, liming, forage plant growth, managing grazing, then overseeding in new establishment, a couple of other things at the very end. So people have often told me the last couple of years that prices for fertilizer is high, so I'm not even going to bother soil testing because I'm not going to be able to afford to buy the fertilizer. Even if you know you can't afford to buy fertilizer, it helps a lot to know what you have to be able to make decisions for now and for in the future. And so, and it's quite simple to do to sample your soils, and your county agents can all help you with that. Farm Clinic and other companies can help you with that. The important thing is that you get a representative sample from your entire pasture. And if you've got a fair bit of acreage, then you really want to be getting samples from each individual pasture. And if you've got a huge pasture, you want to kind of break it down into areas less than 20 acres because you want to be representative within what you have. You want to get about 15 to 20 cores. We use the word cores because we recommend that you use a soil probe that's going to get like a core-like thing that you stick in the ground, and you get a little pocket out so that you can get an exact 4-inch sample, 4-inch deep, little less than an inch around, and you get 15 of those, 20 of those, mix them together to have your sample that you send to the lab. Obviously, it'd be good to avoid areas where animals congregate because there's going to be a high concentration of manure and urine, and so that's going to make it look like you've got better fertility than you do. And you'll also get in a soil test what the pH of your soil is. Fortunately, the cost of lime hasn't gone up as much as other nutrients or other fertilizer products. And a very useful thing about liming is that not only helps the grass grow because of the proper pH, most of our forages will want it to be in the 6 to 6.5, but the other nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, other macronutrients and micronutrients are more available when the pH is in that range, that 6 to 6.5. We've got a publication that we've written a few years ago on the back table on soil sampling and nutrient management in horse pastures. Encourage you to look at that or look that up online. In fact, any publication that I'll mention or others will mention, you can go to our website, for example, our forage website under equine. I'll show you that at the end. But you can even just type in that title and type in University of Kentucky, and that'll pop up. We give very detailed recommendations, but if you take a soil sample yourself and take it to your county agent, they're going to give you recommendations based on these kind of charts, so you don't have to necessarily do all the interpretation on your own. I want to shift now. So soil sample, fertilize according to that. And then I want to mention about plant growth. So all life on Earth is dependent on sunlight, really dependent on the chemical process of photosynthesis. So that's where light energy is converted into chemical energy by plants. Carbon dioxide in the air, water from the rain is absorbed by the leaves. The chemical reaction happens from the light absorbed by the leaves and the chlorophyll, and you have sugar produced and oxygen released. So that's where our horses are gaining their energy. That's where we're gaining our energy from eating plants. That's where we're getting our energy and fossil fuels is stored sunlight from a long time ago. So think about your pastures as a solar panel. In fact, our pastures are a lot more beautiful solar panels than some of the solar farms that are going up around. So you want to maximize the solar panels, which means you want to maximize the amount of leaves available. The more leaves that are there, the more sunlight that's taken up, the more the grass can grow. If you have a closely grazed area, it's not going to be able to take up as much sunlight. So let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. The two plants here are two pots that we dug up material. The one on the left was from a pasture that was rested all winter long. So this is what it looked like coming into the spring. The one on the right was grazed all winter long. So this is day 6. We took them into the greenhouse. We let them grow. You're looking at the amount of growth from both of these. Very similar pastures, except just one had not been grazed over winter, not grazed hard. The other one had been grazed hard. So day 12, day 15, that's the difference in spring growth just from resting. You know, we weren't given different amounts of fertilizer to these. All we were doing was the amount of resting. So you had a better solar panel on that one on the left that had been rested, so it was able to take off and grow. You also had a better root system on that one too, because it had more top growth to go into root growth. The only time the one on the right would be useful is if you were trying to overseed into a pasture, get some new grasses, maybe some more desirable grasses like orchard grass in there, then having grazed hard would cause less competition with the grasses you were trying to put in there. But my main point here is a rested pasture can make a tremendous difference in its growth. So sometimes I use the word rotational grazing. I use that a lot with cattle farmers. It's a bit harder on most horse farms to have groups of horses that are moved from pasture to pasture, and you have a lot of different paddocks in one main group of horses. So I'd like you to think about it to give pastures periodic rest. It doesn't have to necessarily be a set rotation pattern of grazing a pasture for a week and resting it for a month. Any rest period you give is going to enhance stand recovery. It helps interrupt parasite cycles, outcompetes weeds, increases grass growth and carrying capacity by giving periodic rest. And let me just give an example of that with another two plants. These are orchard grass plants. The only difference in these two plants, they were both growing very vigorously for about 6 months. And then we came in the one on the left, we clipped it once a week for a month, clipped it down close like a horse would graze. The one on the right, we clipped it to 3.5 inches at the beginning of the month and at the end of the month. Within 6 days after that last clipping, that's the difference in growth. So giving that rest period, in this case of a month, rather than a weekly grazing or weekly clipping, you had a tremendous difference in growth. People often ask me if they got pastures that they have orchard grass and fescue and bluegrass, and they want to enhance grasses like orchard grass. Here's an example of orchard grass and tall fescue that have both had 1 month of rest. Then you're looking at 6 days of growth after they were clipped off. So they'd been rested for a month. They were both clipped at 3.5 inches. The orchard grass actually is growing back faster than the tall fescue. Orchard grass has a faster growth if given a rest than tall fescue. But typically what happens is horses are grazing the orchard grass closer because it's more palatable. They're repeatedly grazing it. Fescue is growing better and can become more of a problem, if particularly if you have brood mares and you don't want fescue, by that frequent and hard grazing. Underground, if you get into drought periods like we had this past fall, if you can have a better root system on the grasses, then they're going to come back better once it starts raining again. They're going to last better going into a drought. This was a study done back in the 1950s, and they looked at removing different amounts of top growth and looked at what that happened to root growth. Removing 50% of the top growth stopped root growth for a time. A single removal of 90% of the root growth, so in essence cutting the plant all the way down, stopped root growth for 17 days. Root growth did not stop when only 40% or less of the top growth was removed. So we're talking about If you go in a pasture and you graze it down to the ground, then you're stopping root growth. If won't be exactly this, but in here we're talking, better than 2 weeks. And if you continue to graze, then the root growth is not only going to not continue, it's going to the roots are going to shrink back into the plant. So if you can keep the roots, you're going to keep a healthier stand. Now, many of us have pastures like this that are pretty well down to dirt with the last fall or maybe from winter grazing. So I want to talk some about what you can do when your pastures are down close. Now, I talked just over the weekend to a group of beef cattle producers, and I talked about the benefits of frost seeding. What that means is putting seed on the ground this time of year, early mid-February, and letting the frost action, the heaving and shrinking of the soil when it frosts. I've got here some clover seed that I've thrown on top of this frost heaved ground. The problem with frost seeding and talking to you guys and making a firm recommendation on that is frost seeding works really well with clovers, but not as well with grass, just throwing seed on top of the ground. So the definition of frost seeding is broadcasting seed in late winter. Freezing and thawing incorporates the seed. Works well with red and white clover. It's kind of hit or miss with grasses. I like to think about it maybe as a 50-50 chance that you're going to get a good catch by just putting seed on top of the ground and letting the frost action work it in. And then if you wait till, early March, mid-March and throw seed on top of the ground, you don't have much frost after that, and so you don't have any chance of having a stand. However you seed, and I'm going to talk about some other methods that I'm going to recommend more in just a moment, think about the preparation beginning the previous fall. If you're going to do overseeding in the spring, then control broadleaf weeds in the fall. Dr. Whitt will talk in more detail about the importance of controlling weeds ahead of time. Soil test and adjust fertility, reduce residue by grazing hard. Again, don't graze hard unless you're actually trying to get new seed established or new forages established. So a no-till drill does take a bit more effort and attention to detail than just throwing seed out there, but you've got much more consistent results because you're putting seed in the ground into the soil, so you've got good soil to seed contact, much better chance for establishment. You can be successful in the spring or the fall, but seeding depth is very important with a no-till drill. Whether you've got your own no-till drill, whether you're renting one, if you've got someone contract seeding for you, it'd be worth you going out there and making sure that they're getting it at the proper depth. This is after no-till seeding. We've got in that establishment publication some recommendations for different seeding rates, seeding times, different seed mixtures. So I won't go into detail with that. I'll let you grab that Establishing Horse Pastures publication. But I did want to give you this example when I talk about seeding depth. So here's a row of seed on top of the ground. Then we've got quarter, half, 1, 2, and 3 inches deep. This is actually alfalfa seed. We can see the plants a little better than the grass seed, but be very similar with any of our small seeded grasses. 1 week and then 2 weeks after seeding. Anyone have a guess as to what's the best seeding depth? I hope you're still awake. I hope you would say 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. And it seems really obvious here. And when you hear us talk about it, you say, yeah, of course I'm going to get it that shallow. But with a no-till seed drill, it's easy to get it too deep, particularly in the spring when the ground's soft. So you just got to make sure you check and double check that you get that setting properly set. Okay, many people don't have a no-till drill. So another option for those pastures that have very little cover on them would be what we would call a minimum tillage. You'd have a pasture that's either grazed down hard or you go in, graze it hard. You disturb, I've got here 40 to 60% of the sod, but in essence, I mean getting some loose soil, a light disking. I'm not trying to damage the existing plants, but just kind of getting some soil loosened and then broadcasting seed or using a conventional drill, and then coming back and cultipacking or dragging afterwards to get the soil to seed contact. This is not as precise, not as accurate as a no-till drill, but a method that you could do with even small implements. And then once the new seedlings start to grow and your old forages take off and grow even faster, it's important to control competition with grazing or clipping to let those new seedlings get a chance to grow. Now, I'm not saying it right here, but our recommendation for the best time to overseed or to start new pastures is actually in the fall. With the exception of this past fall that was so dry, most every year we have a lot better success with overseeding or with seeding new stands, establishing those and starting to think about it late August, early September. So any type of drag over a pasture is going to help, not going to be as accurate as I mentioned as a no-till drill. Now, here's a number of different forage plants. Bluegrass, well, teff is one that's more of a hay, planted for hay, but bluegrass, tall fescue, orchard grass, and then clovers and ryegrasses on the right. So that's kind of just normal growth. Now, the next slide are those same plants growing at 80% shade. This is what little seedlings are going to be doing if they're planted into a thick stand or the grass that they're planted into starts growing and getting ahead of them. The clovers there are very attenuated or trying to reach up for the sunlight. The other grasses are much smaller. The only grass here that is looking better than it did in the previous slide is orchard grass. Orchard grass is the most shade tolerant grass. So it will handle going into an existing stand, have a better chance of establishing than any of the other grasses. So in short, if you've got a pasture like this, it would need to be grazed down closely before overseeding into that. But now if you had a pasture like that, you probably wouldn't be worrying about overseeding. You want it down close for overseeding. So this is that publication, Establishing Horse Pastures. And I did want to make one other comment by putting this slide back up. The grasses that are doing the best, and this is about a week and a half after planting, are the two ryegrasses on the far right side. Annual ryegrass first and perennial ryegrass. They are two grasses that you can throw on top of the ground here in the spring, late February, March, and they will germinate and put roots down. Most grasses aren't going to grow or aren't going to get the roots in the soil if they're on top of the ground. They are two. The problem is annual ryegrass is only going to live till early summer. Perennial ryegrass is only going to live a couple of years. But for short-term covering the soil, for areas that continually are overgrazed, like around a water, around a gate, then putting a mixture of annual and perennial ryegrass to cover the ground, knowing that you're going to have to do that on a regular basis, maybe every spring and every fall, are options. The other thing is often in our seeding mixtures, seed companies and landowners like to mix in some perennial ryegrass with their orchard grass and bluegrass, or if they're using some of the improved tall fescues, because it comes up quickly, it greens off. It makes a little bit of sense to do that, particularly if it's on hilly ground, because it comes up quick and holds the soil down. But you see how much more vigorous growth those ryegrasses have than the orchard grass and bluegrass and fescue. If you have a very high component in the mixture of a ryegrass, it's going to grow up and take over the stand, shade out the other grasses that you really want long term, then it's going to die off within annual ryegrass just this coming summer, perennial ryegrass within a year or two. So make sure that if you're mixing ryegrass, either type, in with other seed, permanent pasture seed, that you go 15% or less of the mixture. If you were seeding 30 pounds per acre, we're talking about going 3 or 4 pounds of perennial ryegrass. So it's not going to take over the stand. And we do have a note about that in that Establishing Horse Pastures publication. Now, in the last, well, even the last 10 years, but maybe even more so in the last 5 years, we've realized, and many farms have realized, that they need to think about just completely reestablishing certain pastures. So let me just give you some pointers as to what you might think about. If you've got undesirable or unproductive plants in bare soil, and that adds up to 50% or more of the pasture, it's hard to just fix that by just putting more seed in the ground. Maybe you've got the regular infected tall fescue that can be an issue for brood mares. You've got a lot of grasses, annual grasses like crabgrass or foxtail, or weeds like nimblewill that horses do not eat. Or like I say, a lot of bare soil. Maybe you've done some overseeding the last few years, but you're just not getting successful establishment. So if time and finances allow for you to have the amount of time for complete reestablishment, it can often make sense. There are risks because if you spray out a pasture and you get into a dry fall like last fall, then you've got this coming year that you will have to try spring seeding and hope for the best. But if your pasture's got a lot of that infected fescue, a lot of nimblewill, weeds, bare soil, particularly all those add together, then the option I want to have you think about is a complete reestablishment. But start thinking about that early. Don't wait until end of August and say, oh, I guess I need to start over on this pasture. Think about the ones that you want to completely reestablish in this June. Think about these types of things to do. You obviously don't want to do this to your whole farm. You're not going to have any grass left. So if you got, as I mentioned a minute ago, undesirable species covering more than 50% of your pasture, and you've got your stocking rates are low enough, the number of horses that you have, or your ability to feed those horses in a dry lot, that you can rest pastures. Because to completely reestablish, you've got to give a rest period of a number of months for that new pasture to get started. If one of your reasons in reestablishing a pasture is because there's a lot of fescue, and you're worried about that for your late-term brood mares, then you've got to make sure that the fescue that's there doesn't go to seed. That's why I'm talking about thinking about starting in June. So you're going to make sure that you mow, or even there's different herbicides that will suppress the seed heads. You're going to keep it from producing any seed heads this coming spring and early summer. If there is excessive vegetation, you're going to mow that. For complete reestablishment, we found the easiest way to do that is 2 applications of glyphosate 4 to 6 weeks apart, mid-July, end of August. And then you've got dead material there, all the weeds, the fescue, etc. are dead, and you can seed into that without competition. You could do a cultivation, but it's going to take a number of passes with cultivation to make sure that all the weeds and other undesirable grasses are eliminated. Make sure that, and so seeding in this area of Kentucky, we're talking about early September. Make sure that you're using high quality seed. Again, check the depth. I've got here 1/4 inch is the goal. No more than a 1/2 inch. Use the appropriate amount of seed. And we found using, I've talked a lot about the advantages of a no-till drill. The no-till drill does leave spaces between the rows 6 to 7 inches apart. But you can fix that open spaces by just seeding in 2 or 3 directions. So if you were going to seed at 30 pounds per acre, then you could set the seed drill at 10 pounds per acre and go over it in 3 directions. And then you're going to cover most of the ground. Here's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. Here is a farm. The field was sprayed with Roundup in September, seeded 2 weeks later. Here's a photo in October. Particularly with the light, you can't really see the grass, but the next picture I think you can. In December of that same year, they had an excellent stand of orchard grass and Kentucky bluegrass. That's what they seeded. Before that, they had a lot of fescue, a lot of nimblewill, and a number of weeds. And then they ended up with this pasture. But as I said before, pastures need rest. At least 6 months. So you're talking about seeding in the fall, not grazing through that entire fall, not even that next early spring. Then start back in maybe April, May with some light grazing or mowing. So you're talking 6 or 8 months of rest or semi-rest before getting back on those pastures. Think about it. You wouldn't ask a foal to run the Kentucky Derby 6 weeks. Your pastures, you need to let those get a good sod established, because when you reestablish your pasture, you want it to be there 5 or 10 years. Here's another field, a yearling field that was sprayed with glyphosate, seeded in late September. Here's the photos in October and then December. Here's another turnout paddock that was mostly weeds and clover. Clover in moderation, small amounts of clover are great to have that free nitrogen and that quality, but excessive clover can be an issue. So it was sprayed out, 2 different sprays of Roundup, seeded in mid-September. You see the pictures there in December. Now, to be fair, I probably should have taken a picture from someone that did this last fall, and you'd probably be seeing bare ground. But again, we've got to do our best. We can't control the weather. Now, the last thing I want to mention, so I mentioned a lot about taking care of your pastures, overseeding. This is just a little tidbit that I'm going to throw in at the end. A lot of things we do on the farm, whether it's spreading fertilizer, whether it's putting out seed, we can do with a broadcast type spreader, a spinner type spreader, particularly on smaller operations. And this is just an example of how you can greatly improve the uniformity of distribution, whether it's fertilizer or seed, using just a small GPS unit. The one I'm showing you here was the Raven Cruiser 2, was $1,200. It's just a simple one that you're going to mount. This was mounted on an ATV. And we did a little experiment where we had that GPS unit, and it used it going through the field to keep us in straight lines and to keep us from not overlapping. And then we covered it up. We had 2 different technicians down at the Princeton Research Station, and we let them go once without the GPS unit, just kind of eyeballing it, trying to keep everything straight and not overlap too much. This is the difference. One of the technicians, the one actually had more experience, with no guidance, he overlapped by 50%. So he's putting down seed. So in essence, he's wasting 50% of the seed. He's having to go over 50% more, use 50% more seed than normal. The other technician, actually not even on the job for as long, did a bit better, 21% overlap. But both of them were wasting seed. If you were spraying a herbicide, you'd be not only wasting a herbicide, but you could get into some damage issues by where you overlap. You're going to be doing a double spray. And just from a cost standpoint, you may say, well, $1,200, I can't justify that. Let me put it this way. It took the number, on this was a 20-acre, with 20% overlap, and that was the best case scenario in our example. And the cost of the operation, so this might be spraying a herbicide, $30 an acre. We recover the cost of that GPS unit in 250 acres. So several years of spraying or seeding. When you got to something like paying more money, like the cost of seed that might be 70 an acre or even more than that, we actually 20% overlap, paid for that in just 107 acres. So think about that as a potential way to improve, particularly if you do a lot of the work yourself. Wanted to leave you with just a picture of our forage website. I go there usually just by Googling KY forages, and particularly highlight one of the tabs there in the middle is the equine tab. And that has a number of publications and several videos, the equine pasture management. We've got upcoming events there. We've also got the YouTube channel in the top right. That's where we'll have the recordings of this meeting, plus many past meetings. And this is the equine tab. A couple of things to highlight there is if you're not receiving the email newsletter called Equine Science Review that comes out once a month, has the latest research, the University of Kentucky, and other collaborators that we work with. We've got some detail on this equine tab on the Forage website on the UK Pasture Evaluation Program that Krista runs. And as I said, a number of publications as well. I'm the moderator, and so I want to keep us on time. Is there a quick question or two while we have Dr. Hayes come up and get shifted over?